what's negotiating deals like? How much do we really know? Or, even before like the numbers, like the sources is he's talking to here, there's interest here, or, there was that whole thing with Darius Slay's team where
Yeah.
Howie said, hey, you can go and get a trade. How much do we really know, or how much is reported actually kind of true?
Yeah, I mean, teams tend to be pretty tight-lipped, and the agents tend to be pretty loose-lipped. So you don't know what exactly is true out there. But, you know, in terms of negotiations, I think what people have to understand is for 90 to 95% of NFL player negotiations, the team has the upper hand. How many contracts are the Eagles doing this year? Well, 90% of them, they're telling the player what he's going to make, basically. All the draft picks, all the lower round guys, all the lower tier guys on the roster. And then now and then, Howie will do a contract where, yeah, the other side's got a little bit of leverage, whether it's the A.J. Brown deal or, whatever's going to be, Hassan Reddick. But that's why, as a team, you try to keep the negotiations early. And I was doing this, Joe Banner was doing this, get to guys early so they never get sniffs of free agency, because once free agency is on the table, all bets are off. You can't negotiate the way you want to negotiate because you're beholden to other teams and the way they negotiate. And the saying, you're only as good as the worst deal out there. So everyone can find a safety that makes this, a corner that makes this, and say, hey, I'm better than that guy. And then you just have to deal with it. The one thing I had, and I've been asked a lot about this lately with Lamar Jackson, I had players come to me and say, hey, Andrew, you're cool. You're a former agent. I don't need an agent. So we did deals straight up. And I thought at the beginning, that's cool. It's going to be fun. And I hated it. I hated it. And I know what Eric DeCosta of the Ravens is going through. I don't know how he's dealt with this, where players want to negotiate directly because you're telling a guy he's not as good as he thinks. You're telling him his self-worth is not what it is. You're telling him, they're not sophisticated negotiators. They're like, hey, I'm better than that guy. Pay me more. And I'm like, well, that guy's 1 year from free agency. You're 3 years from whatever. They don't want to hear that. Negotiations are emotional. They're raw, but they're also sophisticated where you're looking at value, right? It's not so much I'm better than him. What's the value? How close are you to free agency? What's your age? What's your history? What's your injury history? All these things go into the mix. And sometimes people don't appreciate that. Wow, like Kirk Cousins is making more. It doesn't matter. He was a free agent.
Mhm.
This is all the things you have to lock in.
It's a good segue, actually, because Philadelphia, as you know, is a very emotional thinking city when it comes to sports. I think a lot of fans still have raw feelings about how Brian Dawkins left the organization 15 years ago. And so I'm always very curious of the balance with veteran guys, fan favorites, about like when you let them walk versus keeping them around too long. Is it an emotional thing? Are you not willing to let go? Talk about Brandon Graham, Jason Kelsey, Fletcher Cox. I'm curious if you had a philosophy on that, as far as veterans and knowing when's the time to walk away versus keeping a guy around.
Yeah, I mean, you can see Green Bay and what's going on with Aaron. That tended to be a philosophy there, to kind of move on before it gets too late and always build a pipeline of young players coming in. I think it's similar here in Philly. And by the way, I did consult with the Eagles for a couple of years when Andy and Joe brought me in there when Howie was moving from cap to personnel, and they needed an experienced person to do some of the contracts. But I just think the Eagles, I mean, Andy came from Green Bay. It was the same thing when I worked with him. And then you just have this feeling like, okay, where are we hanging on too long? It looks to me like what they've decided is just to continue this mix of a growing base of young players, but also have these guys around that they think can still be productive. It was before it was Jason Peters, one more year, let's squeeze another year out of them. Now they're squeezing more out of Graham and Cox and Kelsey because they're still productive. They're not what they were, but they're still productive. And they need that in the locker room with a young team. You got to find that right mix. You never want to be an old cap loaded team like the Rams right now. And you never want to be this young team, or you really don't want to be the Bears, which are all young players with no payroll. So the Eagles are trying to get that mix.